So tonight is about what I characterize as active hope. And really that's only half true, because I'm borrowing active hope as an expression from the extraordinary Joanna Macy. I've had the great privilege of working and studying with Joanna, and the idea of active hope, that the subtitle actually is remarkable in her book, how to face the mess we're in without going crazy. But the deeper meaning of this is embedded right here. This is how things are now. But choices I make influence or shape what comes next. And so the opportunity before all of us is defining and owning and not being shy about what is our hope. What is it we believe is possible? And in a few minutes I'm going to talk about the idea of narrative, because I believe that storytelling lies at the heart of how we move from what I would characterize as a preoccupation with transactional work to the necessary impulse of transformational work. But we only get there when we articulate a story that pulls people in. We only get there when we have the courage to be honest about our hope. What is our hope? What is it that I am prepared to stand for? And I frequently draw inspiration from another teacher and mentor of mine, the poet David White, who reminds us that the great mistake is to act this drama as if you're alone. You and your networks are a very powerful collective. And it's within that context that we will, in fact, address the climate crisis. So, a personal disclosure, and it's probably obvious by now, I believe in my bones, I believe that any human activity is an opportunity to engage in a positive and healthy relationship with all of life. To be a positive and active participant for a very particular future. I share that with you explicitly because I realize there are, of course, alternative points of view. But that is part of the presence that I bring to my work. And it's part of the presence that I try to bring to the people with whom I work, so that when I say certain things, they understand the context at a personal level in terms of where I'm really coming from. So, framing the conversation tonight, I want to invite you to think about following the larger game and not the ball. I want you to think about the dream you have for the community in which you live. For many of us, that's right here in the Greater Victoria region, but it doesn't matter. What is your dream for your community? And the role of innovation in making that dream a reality. Gunther has happily put one manifestation of innovation on the table already with solar CRD. That's an arrow in the metaphorical quiver. But we get preoccupied with innovation and don't go deeper. And the deeper part is this. Do you have the trust among stakeholders, those high-impact, high-influence stakeholders, necessary to have the conversations that will actually deliver the innovation you need? Your great mistake is to act the drama as if you're all alone. You must work as a collective. You must engage the right people at the right time, and from that engagement, you surface the real possibilities. And, we don't need reminders of what's going on. It has permeated the popular culture. This is the National Geographic cover from last September. We can look at cities and assets globally that are most at risk. The green circles represent financial exposure. The red circles indicate populations. All you really need to know is that the larger circle represents $3 trillion or more of financial assets at risk from sea level rise in this century. The red circles indicate 14 million or more people exposed. What I do find interesting, and I've been tracking this now for about 15 years, is that there was a time when conversations about sustainability, conversations about renewable energy, and so on would be the domain of niche journals, journals focused on energy, the environment. And that has continued. But beginning in 1999 and continuing to this day, the Harvard Business Review has actually become something of a barometer for me. In 1999, HBR published a cover story by the business professor Stuart Hart called Beyond Greening, Strategies for a Sustainable World. Cover story, Harvard Business Review, 15 years ago. At the end of 1999, that article won the McKinsey Prize for the most influential article that year in HBR. And it's ushered in a very interesting era where business schools, business and management magazines have actually become, I will not suggest the more influential, but they have certainly become this very provocative voice in raising awareness about initially the risk and therefore the business consequences of not dealing with something. And that's a very particular narrative strand that I'll return to. But more recently, the opportunities. So this is the April issue, this year, April issue of Harvard Business Review, The Resilient Company, How to Thrive in a Warmer World. Now, for what it's worth, there is a lot of content in this magazine about the very real biophysical, ecological, and other impacts associated with climate change. But so too is there what they refer to as an opportunity for the big pivot. How organizations, particularly businesses, can redefine themselves to be that much more energy efficient, eco-efficient, and so on. I also want to just put a marker down in terms of what I refer to as the lure of the local. You know, we sometimes think that addressing climate change is a federal domain or a provincial or state domain, and goodness knows it would be great to have uniformity of support across all levels of government. But ultimately, we live at the local. This is where we chase the dream of sustainability. And Guy deserves great recognition for the work he has done for many, many years now, providing very tangible, practical solutions for folks in their backyard. Local communities are crucibles for climate action. Local governments are the primary communication channel for raising awareness of both the risk and the opportunity. And we're seeing a very interesting interplay beginning to play out now. We've seen, the first municipality sued by an insurance company for not taking requisite precautions in the face of climate change. Now that's a negative vector into this conversation, but you know what? It's reflective of how fast the conversation is evolving. Local governments are also centers of innovation and policymaking. We don't give them nearly enough credit for that, but they are on the front lines. So a word about innovation. We always talk about the disruptive innovator, that individual who's just sparking ideas, and we celebrate them, and we should. But the disruptive innovator alone is not enough. So 3 types of innovators are needed to achieve broad systemic change. And believe me when I say the climate crisis is the defining systemic problem. We do need that disruptive innovator who has the big idea, or big ideas, plural. But crucially, we need the bridging innovators, those folks who can spot the big idea, tease it away from all of the other noise, and translate it in a way that resonates for people. And then we need a receptive innovator, someone who can implement that idea. So again, it's not enough to simply say, let's talk about the innovative idea. Let's parse that and understand that, again, you need that collective of skills. So my questions, and just think about these tonight. Which one are you? Are you a disruptive innovator, a bridging innovator, a receptive innovator? And do you know or work with others? And do you have the trust that allows you to collaborate meaningfully? Because there's the other word. If it's not innovation, it's collaboration. And the great assumption underlying all of that is that we trust each other. And again, we're not courageous enough or honest enough to acknowledge that, hey, many of you may not trust me. You've just met me. Why on earth would you collaborate with me? And so at least naming that and then working to build the trust that allows us to identify what kind of innovator we might be and how we might work together. That's where we go deeper to the next layers of climate action. You know, it's enough to skate across the surface and, you know, spark a few initial projects and what have you, but if we're really going to go deep, we need to understand that there is much that behavioral psychology, among other disciplines, has to offer us. So what do we know? I'll be brief here because this is a very literate audience. This is the cover story from the American Association for the Advancement of Science report released in March. And what we know at a big picture level, a global level, is that we are at risk of pushing our climate system toward abrupt, unpredictable, and potentially irreversible changes with highly damaging impacts. That's the consensus view. 97% of climate scientists worldwide agree on that point. And waiting to take action will inevitably increase costs, escalate risk, and foreclose options to address the risk later on. So all the more reason to get really clear on the nature of the intervention that your association, for instance, can most effectively make. And crucially, where your association can partner with others. And in so doing, amplify the impact and create an amplified field for communication. The bottom line, human-caused climate change, of course, is happening. We face risks. Responding now will lower the risk and cost of taking action. And here's another thing. Alongside Harvard Business Review, Bloomberg Businessweek. My God, hardly a paragon of environmental activism. But Bloomberg Businessweek has increasingly been pointing out, folks, the world's failure to take meaningful action on our climate may one day be seen as the greatest mistake of our time. And I mean, I don't mind telling you, this week's edition of Bloomberg is just filled with, you know, data points that increasingly you can begin to connect the dots. So here's the World Health Organization pointing out that just under 3,400 people died in central London in 2010 from inhaling diesel particulates. You know, just a data point. You know, here's the 38,000 square miles in the U.S. devastated by the mountain pine beetle. And it goes on. Now, these are typically framed in the language of economic loss, social dislocation, and that's part of the narrative that is beginning to emerge. Some of you will be familiar with a narrative that has been emerging for some time now. Ronald Wright's Short History of Progress articulated it, I think, quite brilliantly. But more recently, Bill Reese has published papers in this regard. Paul and Ann Ehrlich last year talked about the notion of civilization collapse. And they talk about it not because of climate change per se. They talk about the fact that climate change initiates a chain of events. Climate change causes environmental impacts that in turn trigger social and economic dislocation, leading to profound social unrest. It is only when we begin to connect these dots and construct a narrative that reaches people at a core level that we elevate the conversation from a purely technical one, or an engineering one, or a scientific one, to something far more profound. So, I have to, of course, talk about what British Columbia has done. Because what British Columbia has done is, on a global scale, really quite breathtaking. But, of course, there are a number of tendrils that fall away from that conversation that we'll pick up. So, BC's Climate Action Plan, I think, is well known by most people in this room, but it's worth reiterating. This was the big, hairy, audacious goal. How do we take a third of carbon emissions out of the provincial economy by 2020 without cratering the economy? And how do we take 80% out by 2050? And so, a variety of metaphorical arrows in that metaphorical quiver. An adaptation strategy, the revenue-neutral carbon tax, and so on. And actions in every sector of the economy. And more recently, in the BC Jobs Plan and the Green Economy updates, messages from the Premier and the Minister of Environment to the effect that BC is and will remain a climate change leader. So that's the plan. Our record to date, well, we do in fact have the first revenue-neutral carbon tax in North America. Depending on how you count the numbers, slightly over 90% clean and renewable electricity generation, first carbon-neutral government in North America, climate action charter with local governments that, frankly, I would suggest to you, does not get nearly the attention it deserves. When people talk about British Columbia's achievements, everyone celebrates the carbon tax, and rightly so. But you know, the Climate Action Charter and the flexibility that was both built into it, and let's acknowledge the very deft lobbying by the Union of BC Municipalities, but the flexibility that has been incorporated into the Climate Action Charter is largely responsible for the breathtaking innovations that we're now seeing at a local level across the province. So I actually think the Climate Action Charter is our signal achievement to date that has only begun to realize its full potential, and a variety of other things going on. One more word about the Climate Action Charter. 182 of 190 local governments have signed the Charter. And you know, when they signed the Charter, it's probably fair to say they were caught up in the moment, and didn't really fully understand what they were getting into, because there are three commitments in that charter. Measure your greenhouse gas footprint, commit to moving towards carbon neutrality, but the third one, whether you're urban or rural, build a complete, compact, energy-efficient community. My God, there is a lifetime of work building a complete, compact, energy-efficient community. But what's interesting now is that because government didn't say, you must do this, you must use this technology, you must do it in this way, et cetera, we're seeing that beautiful flowering of creativity. And yes, mistakes along the way, radical stuff. Frankly, what we're seeing is the stuff of real collaboration and innovation happening at a local level because of the charter. So reactions to the plan. I would suggest to you that the supporters of the plan, and this takes the long view from 2008, 2009 through to the current day. Supporters of the plan would say, well, there's absolutely been international praise and recognition, and it's very fair to say that against what I would suggest to you is a relatively modest bar globally, real leadership for BC. Strong ANGO support for the climate action plan, especially the carbon tax. The skeptics have routinely said that the reduction targets are not practical. Some have said they're unachievable. Many business stakeholders continue to say that the carbon tax is a drag on competitiveness, despite abundant empirical evidence to the contrary. But rather than dwell on what has been done, what does the future look like? Where do we step from this moment? So, what success might look like in the future? Imagine. It's like the first sentence of the first paragraph in Natural Capitalism, where Paul Hawken and Amory and Hunter Lovins say, imagine. Imagine a neighborhood where the cars are whisper quiet. And they paint this image. And you can't help but think, my God, regardless of where you might be on the ideological continuum, you want to live in that neighborhood. So imagine a transportation system that reduces distances driven and is powered by clean energy. Efficient infrastructure that uses clean energy to deliver power to the grid. An innovative waste system with full recycling and composting and complete landfill gas capture. A forest sector with more trees that are growing faster and living longer. Electricity that is 100% clean. Environmentally sensitive industries that are efficient, use clean energy, and capture their own emissions. Let's take that and deconstruct it. This is a very simple schematic where you firstly have the awareness. This is A, B, C, D, E. It's straightforward. You must have the awareness. You must have the awareness that the problem you face is more significant than any problem you have ever tackled before. And that's what makes it fun. You have that awareness, and so you anchor yourself with baseline analysis. Like, where are we today? And then you articulate the compelling vision. Now, I would suggest to you, I was not inside government when the original Climate Action Plan was written, and I both celebrated it at the time and lamented the fact that there really wasn't a clear, coherent, compelling vision. There was a big quiver with a bunch of arrows stuffed into it, but there wasn't necessarily that absolutely compelling vision around which all sectors of the economy could mobilize. So that compelling vision, and by the way, this also applies in a very meaningful way to your association as you think about your own future. And then you backcast. You know where you are right now, you've got that compelling vision, you backcast and say, okay, now what are the specific actions we are going to take, and how do we measure success along the journey? And the questions you should always ask. Does this particular action move us in the right direction? Is it a flexible platform? Is it a good return on our investment, financially and otherwise? Because it's sometimes said that anyone who studies economics, all they'll remember 10 years later is supply and demand. The thing I remember and live every day is opportunity cost. You know, a choice to do one thing or invest in one thing means you are not doing something else. You are not investing in something else. And social opportunity cost is one of the defining issues around climate action. So a vision of 2050. Nobody's committed to this. Nobody has said this is what we will do. But we could do this. We can have full deployment of natural gas or better. Or better. In commercial transport. We could have 100% electric personal vehicle fleet. We could. Majority of buildings supply clean energy to the grid. Full composting and recycling for homes and businesses. Complete landfill gas capture, etc. The point here is that, on the one hand, a lot of folks that I talk to say, you know, that 80% reduction by 2050, I mean, on the one hand, that is so far into the future, it might as well be meaningless. And I suppose you could take that point of view. I prefer to take the point of view that, you know, a whole host of things are going to happen between now and 2050. We know this. And no matter what we do, we know that it's not a straight line. But we can reinvent the world in 36 years. We have done it before in a much shorter period of time. It becomes a question of political and societal will. But any vision that you articulate, you can do this. You know, the textbook example for many of a big, hairy, audacious goal was John F. Kennedy's moonshot. And it's worth remembering that Kennedy gave that speech, the essence of which was, you know, we shall send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth within the decade. Not within 36 years, within the decade. Net cost to do that makes what we're talking about, you know, within the realm of possibility, believe me. So I said I wanted to talk about the idea of narrative. And I want you to think about the extent to which your community has a narrative. For those of us who live in the capital region, we will, for the most part, I think, know that the CRD has been bravely, I will acknowledge, steering a regional sustainability strategy. I think the aspiration that plans of that type now require exceeds what is currently on offer, but it's at least a narrative and a vision of some sort. But regardless of where you live, what is your community's narrative? And for the organizations of which you are a part, what is your organization's narrative? Not its policies, not its codes of conduct or anything like that, but what's its narrative? And there are fundamentally three positions, I believe, that we can talk about. And it's all about, on this graphic I've said change for sustainability, but I've already acknowledged that the second generation of sustainability that we are living in right now is all around the energy, economy, environment nexus. It is about climate. So there's a reactive narrative, a prevailing narrative that basically suggests we should react to this trend. And you're actually seeing a lot of that play out in a variety of organizations. It's being played out in the media. You know, as recently as the weekend, I was reading about a number of groups in Canada and the US who basically were saying, yeah, climate change is real, we're causing it, but should we dismantle Western civilization to address it? I suggest on a very personal level, yes, hell yes, we absolutely should. There's a defensive narrative, which is quite prevalent, that basically suggests we should act because others have had good results. So there's cost savings to be had. Lots of businesses, and for that matter, the provincial government too. We spend just under $500 million a year on energy costs. So the notion of reducing costs, it's there. Or we should act because if we do not, something bad will happen to us. If we don't maintain the infrastructure, a hospital or a school is going to collapse and so forth. And those are very real, what I would characterize as instrumental kinds of narratives. And then we have the offensive strategy, or the offensive narrative, that says, wait a second, we should act because an evaluation of our situation suggests action is in our best interest. So recall that comment earlier. We are at risk of abrupt, unpredictable, and irreversible change with profound social and economic consequences. That's the burning platform, folks. So action truly is in your best interest. And if that's not enough for you, what about good old-fashioned excellence? We should act because these actions demonstrate excellence. And we aspire to excellence in all that we do. What is your higher calling? Can we draw forth the very best of ourselves? Not the cynical, not the jaded, but can we call forth the very best of ourselves to address this? And that means switching the narrative entirely so that it's not an us-them conversation where we are desperately seeking a seat at the table and trying to convince people, please just give me a little bit more. But rather, this is seen to be core to the task of governing, core to the task of managing, core to the ways in which we live, work, and play every day. And in all of this, the end game is extraordinary communities. Not average communities, not acceptable communities, but extraordinary communities. And these are communities that are resilient in the face of change, whether environmental, economic, or other. Resilient in the face of change. That are, of course, characterized by abundant clean land, water, and air. Communities with abundant green space that's easily accessible. Healthy residents, connected residents. Communities that are rich in social and cultural capital and intergenerational wisdom. And rich in opportunity and possibility. That's the end game. Paint a picture about those kinds of communities and don't get distracted by this stuff. This is the day-to-day reality that I see my colleagues in government and the private sector grappling with. Smart asset management, reduced energy costs, superior delivery of public services, increased social cohesion, and so on. These are not insignificant. They matter, but they are means to that broader, deeper end. Or as I put it here, these are servant outcomes that feed that ultimate objective. And that ultimate objective, this becomes the frame on which you can begin to hang a story. So for instance, full disclosure, there's a piece coming out in Focus magazine in July where, an initiative that I've been developing with some colleagues outside of government called 50 by 20 begins to come out of the closet. And I don't want anyone who reads the piece to take it literally, but I essentially say, rather than talk about a very modest, incremental change in, take your pick, modal share, fossil fuel replacement, etc. Well, let's just throw down the gauntlet and say, why can't we reduce fossil fuel consumption by 50% by 2020? Why can't we grow 50% of our food by 2020? And I know the answer to many of these questions, but the point is to be deliberately provocative so that somebody can say, well, we can't do 50, we can do 20. Okay, let's do 20. It's a heck of a lot better than 2. So the end game is the creation of these kinds of communities. And very quickly, because I do want to leave some time for discussion before we have to get the heck out of here. There are some really good examples of cross-government collaboration and innovation. And this is not an exhaustive list, but I've genuinely been surprised and impressed by the willingness of some of my colleagues in government to begin to inhabit more of themselves and to bring more of their true presence and essence to the fore. And so, the whole idea of quality urban energy systems of tomorrow, the community energy and emissions inventory, the Live Smart Leaders community, and the list goes on. These are all things that, on the one hand, some of you in this room have had your fingerprints on, but these are all things that happened because people chose to be really honest with themselves. And they chose to reach out and extend themselves and work as a collective. And I just want to highlight a couple of things here. So this is the Green Communities Committee and the Climate Action Charter. Now, for any of you who have studied the speed of trust or any of the work from the Franklin Covey Institute, what I've highlighted here in terms of key trust behaviors is just shorthand. And it's really there to remind you that this great thing that now exists, called the Climate Action Charter, that has resulted in all of these wonderful things on the right-hand side of the screen. Virtually all local governments have signed it. 50% have plans covering 75% of the provincial population and so on. All of that stuff. It would not have happened if people had talked straight, committed to delivering results, confronted reality, and clarified their expectations. There were other trust behaviors that could probably be identified, but again, naming these things, not just kind of leaving it up to fate or chance or circumstance, but actually saying, no. I'm going to own my own stuff. I'm going to name it, and you're going to do likewise, and we're going to work through this. And just, this is, data that I'll be updating very shortly, but, 3,600 local government actions in just 2 years, 28 carbon neutral communities, 40 carbon reserve funds, all of that messy vitality happening because people engaged in the practice of active hope. Exhibit 2, Meeting the Climate Change Challenge. So this was, on the one hand, a piece of pointy-headed academic research. I won't lie to you. But, PICS funded, involved the Climate Action Secretariat of the province of BC, a raft of academic institutions, BC Hydro, etc., really taking a look at the first generation of the Climate Action Charter with a view to, well, where do we go from here? Could there be a Climate Action Charter 2.0? Could we take the lessons of the Charter and apply it in other sectors of the economy, and so forth? And again, a number of key trust behaviors at work, but, honestly, if you ever want to see the professional equivalent of a cat fight, get a group of academics together and ask them to collaborate. But remarkably, multiple academic institutions, BC Hydro, the province, and the ability to not just show up and expect good things to happen, but to recognize that in the absence of trust, none of this is going to work. And I think the last example I'll highlight here is the province, variety of NGOs, First Nations, forestry companies, and coastal communities agreeing on the protection of a globally significant rainforest, the Great Bear Rainforest, 64,000 square kilometers. Again, there are times when we become, I think, inured to some of the developments that are going on around us. But this was a significant achievement, and a globally significant achievement. And again, it would not have happened without very particular trust behaviors being displayed. So, all of this, everything I've talked about, is about resisting the temptation to jump to the technical, engineering, and scientific solution or answer. And it's instead about acknowledging that to the extent magic really exists, all magic is a shift in consciousness. In fact, there is the takeaway. All magic is a shift in consciousness. We face, it is my considered opinion, we face one of the most globally significant challenges to human civilization. It will take magic to overcome it. It will take a shift in consciousness to overcome it. And that shift in consciousness will unlock the doors behind which the technical, engineering, scientific, social, psychosocial, and other solutions lie. Sustainable, resilient, extraordinary communities, these are not puzzles, these are not problems. These are futures to be created. And all of us are the architects. So we sometimes say that all living systems on this planet are in decline, and the rate of decline is accelerating. The Earth needs a new operating system. We're the programmers. We're the architects. And we need to get to work right now, but in wholly new ways, beyond anything we have experienced or dared to step into previously. And as we think about what that could look like, as we think about impact on the community, the capacity to create shared value, or what I sometimes refer to as societal and shareholder value. This is about how you unpack your story, your organization's story, and the story of possibility that lies at the heart of this. There's an exploration stage. And for instance, back to Nigel. I'm going to beat up on Nigel for leaving early. Back to Nigel and the association. They've done the exploration. There's no question. They have a notion of what the story is, what the audience is, what the key levers could be. There's two that are being a focal point right now, and the internal capacity is being mobilized. The execution stage is where most things fall down. But the execution stage is very much about being courageous. So don't wait. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for somebody else. Don't wait for regulation. Remove your own ego. That's a tough one. Because we associate, our ego with our sense of self, our identity. It's like, really? Really? Empower others to act. Again, the great mistake is to act the drama as if you're all alone. Empower others to act. Produce short-term wins. Communicate for understanding. Don't just communicate. Communicate for understanding. And continually check in with those with whom you are communicating to ensure that, yeah, they understand it. Or indeed, they understand it and have an even better idea that builds on yours. Because there's the other thing about communication. Tell me if this resonates for you. How many of you spend your days, excuse me, and if you reflected on the nature of your communication in that day, there was a lot of downloading of information and a lot of debating back and forth. And that's sort of the stuff of everyday life, and we can't avoid it. But how often do you manage to move into really empathic conversation and ultimately generative dialogue where you have an idea and I have an idea and somebody else has an idea and we layer them and build something extraordinary together, well beyond what we might have been able to create individually. Getting to that place of empathic and generative dialogue, again, that's where the real transformational as opposed to transactional stuff happens. And ultimately, what is it we need to do from an evolutionary point of view? You know, I went back to school as a mid-career professional to do my doctorate. And I was hardcore, quantitative, analytical, number crunching. I wanted to measure the business value of sustainability and do multiple regression analysis. And I did. And then I realized it was largely worthless. Because I had this fateful encounter with a behavioral psychologist. And she reminded me that we spend so much time focusing on attitudes and behavior change. How often do we talk about behavior change when we talk about climate action? It's like everywhere. But unless we have simultaneously paid attention to changing structures and processes, you know, we might actually be effective at convincing somebody to park their car or get rid of their car. But if we haven't created easy, accessible, beautiful bike lanes, pedestrian walkways, awesome transit, etc., if we haven't changed those fundamental structures and processes, we're hooped. And what's playing out right now in real time in the Lower Mainland with respect to transit? You know, it's ultimately about structures and processes. So change structures, processes, as well as attitudes. Take a long-term focus, serve all of your stakeholders. And while you're doing it, raise the governance bar. The governance bar for the organizations of which you're a part, the communities of which you're a part. And never forget that at every moment you have a choice. At every moment, you can be overwhelmed by the enormity of the challenge, or you can say, okay, this is how things are now. I wish they were different, but this is how they are now. My choice, or my choices, do influence what happens next, for me and my household, for me and my tribe. And if I'm smart, and I begin to make the kind of network connections, that degree of influence can actually be significantly bigger than what I might think. So, as a jumping off point to conversation, what is your hope? And how can you be active in breathing life into that?